The next area we're going to cover is the tribal world. We're at the clock again, pushing up against. We're going to take about a 3 or 4 minute break. And welcome back. You know, this next section is the tribal world, which, as I said earlier, is sort of where my passion is when I think about government. You know, working within government. And here's what I always used to hear whenever I'd go into virtually anywhere in the native world was, "I'm gonna fight for my village." I mean, I don't know how many times I heard that, which I loved hearing because it tells me there was passion there. But then what my job was to change fight to "I'm going to build my village." And this was a very different thing, you see, because within the village, all that passion, remember, this is families that have been together for generations that care about what's going on in their community. They really do. And the amount of passion that gets released, as long as it's not about somebody being abusive or somebody stealing or something like this, if it's about how to make it better, man, that's all I ever wanted, was when I can find that much passion, I know what I can do with it. I can turn that into their dream, whatever that is. If they have that much passion, that's the magic. You see, what I was explaining in the early portions of this is thoughts with emotion and intent. That's how you create reality. Now, when you get that level of emotional intent and thought, that's powerful. That's why being close to the earth, being close to each other, being close in relationship is so powerful. And why the isolation that we have in the world right now, the separation that we have in the world, that's being emphasized actually under the guise of cooperation. They've actually created increased division. Think about how it's playing out. It's increased division. Why is that? Remember when I was talking about beliefs many hours ago, and I was using the example of the woman in Saudi Arabia dressed in black, but feeling very happy and good about herself, and the woman on the beach in France without her top on, feeling perfectly fine, and the woman in Iowa just kind of wondering about both of them and just liking her house dress. And all of them were right according to beliefs. But beliefs all the time don't work out so good. Think about all those missionaries that believed these young savages, as they called them, needed a boarding school. Okay, they meant well, they didn't do well. That's always the case, it seems like, when you come into an area. And that was my paper I delivered for the Orthodox. And actually the invitation, the way that all rolled up, I want to tell a little bit about that story. Is I was lecturing on harp, and I'll cover more on that later, in the European Parliament. And then I was invited to a group called GLOBE, the 12th Assembly, and it was 200 legislators, 44 governments. I was presenting on HARP, another guy was presenting on the nuclear cores that were disintegrating in the Arctic and getting ready to ruin a whole bunch of real estate and ocean. And in all the stuff that was being raised, the third one was the book Our Stolen Future and the work at MIT on chemicals being released into the environment that were feminizing species across the platform, particularly in the north where the food chain was short and where particulates tended to concentrate. They were seeing this. And after my presentation ran about an hour, an elderly woman approached me and she says, "My name is Maria Beckett, and we trace our roots to the island of Patmos and the revelation of John, and I represent the Orthodox Church in Greece and Istanbul," she said to me, which is kind of a big thing. And she says, "You've just delivered the apocalypse," and discussing some of the technologies I just covered. And I thought that was kind of an interesting way to see it, considering who she was and who she said she represented. And John, you know, the revelation of John is the book of Revelations in the Bible, by the way, for those that don't know that. And the Orthodox were with the Catholics up until 1054 AD when they split, and they took the eastern part of the world supposedly, and the Catholics took the rest. And you kind of know most of the rest of the story, but the Orthodox we sort of forgot about many parts of the world. But there's 5 patriarchs, and they're equals. And the first among equals comes from Constantinople, what is today Istanbul, and that's Bartholomew I, who's called the Green Patriarch, which is kind of interesting. And the reason is he's an environmentalist, which is kind of interesting. But the reason he is because of a verse in his book called Revelations 11:18, which says that God will destroy those that destroy the earth. That's what he says. And if you go back to the beginning of this conversation many hours ago, we talked about stewardship within the earth as part of the plan. And so doesn't that kind of make sense if you were a bad steward that, you kind of screwed that up too in the garden of the earth? But we have all this potential within this garden that is the earth. And within that potential is the possibility of change. And so the tribal world is very close to the earth. They've depended on the earth for sustenance and for wealth and for happiness until other cultures arrived and started screwing it up. And they had their own classes of culture. Alaska has 228 tribal governments, half the tribal governments in the country. Most people don't know that. There's like 12 major linguistic groups, and then there's dialects within those, dozens, in fact. It's such a big area. Think about Europe, and how many languages there are. Then you can think about Alaska, too, for big chunks of that. So very diverse, very different value systems, very different ways of running governments. And they used to slave between each other. You want to talk about slavery in the Americas, started with Native Americans. They used to enslave each other. They'd catch people and they'd make them work, or they'd, use them in other ways. But slavery was common among indigenous. That was what you did. They did the hard lifting, the ones you got from the other village. It's also the way you mix the gene pool, quite frankly, and you weren't inbreeding with your family all the time. It happened by raiding parties or trading parties. But somebody was having a party, and that was what was going on. The new missionaries into the world were the environmentalists and the politicians and everyone else coming in. But the story I told to Globe and what I learned from them was enough. And they invited me then to a second conference. This one was on the Black Sea, and it was an environmental conference called Science, Religion, and the Environment. Right? Now that was an interesting one. For that one, I'll tell the short version of the story. I'll tell the long version some other day. But the short version of it is, I end up taking this trip and I go to Athens to meet everyone. And then in Athens, we get two 727s chartered to take us over to Trabzon, Turkey, to meet a Greek ship in a Turkish port. Anyone knows anything about modern politics knows that doesn't happen. How did that happen? Well, somebody that owns 7 or 8%, I think even it might have been as high as 9% now that I think about it, but it was 7 or 8% of the Turkish GMP, the gross national product, the whole wealth of the nation was going through this guy's hands regularly. So they pretty much could let him do whatever, and so he got the ship there. But a lot of people didn't like that idea, and a big protest showed up. They were the Grey Wolves, which were Turkish nationalists, and they liked to throw rocks at buses full of people like us, I guess, because the rocks were flying and the police were there, and they were trying to keep everyone away. They managed to do it pretty well, and they had 4 police cars with 4 cops in each one, 2 on each side of the bus, in the front and the back, and all the different buses that we were. There was a bunch of us, and so 450 of us end up on the ship, and we weren't taking any land cruises that day, so we hung out on the ship. But there were only 450 of us, and then 50 members of the international press that were invited. And the ship was set up for 2,000. There was a bigger crew than there were passengers. But it was all us, and it was a closed conference, and it included all 5 patriarchs from the Orthodox Church, representatives of the Pope, the Aga Khan from the Muslim faith, Nobel Prize winners in science, politics. I mean, everything you could win Nobel Prize winnings on, they were there. The big corporations, BlackRock, all the big ones were there. So we had representation from the Buddhists, Hindus, everybody. It was this big mix. We had the head of the Union of Concerned Scientists on board, writers, authors like myself, others. And I thought I'm going to be there to talk about HARP. They brought me all this way to do this thing. I get there and I'm not on the agenda. I'm a rapporteur in one of the sessions. I go, what am I doing here? And she says, I wanted you to, Maria Beckett again, she goes, I wanted you to meet people and they need to meet you. And that's why you're here. All right, now I'm on this ship for 12 days with all these people. I don't believe in something for nothing. So I spend the time learning everything I can by all the best minds in the entire region, anthropologists, archaeologists, economists, vice presidents of all the countries we're visiting. You know, there's 7 of them. I meet a lot of people. I learn a lot. I learn fast. When I got all done, I integrated into a paper I wrote called The Environment and Poverty. 6 months later, I get another invitation from the Patriarchy, and they want me to attend a conference called The Environment and Poverty. I think, wow, that's weird. I just wrote them a paper about that, you know, a few months before. So I asked the foreign minister of the Patriarchy in Istanbul, I said, did you read my paper? I go, I really can't come as a participant. I can't afford to go there and spend that kind of time. I'm just too small of an operation. So he says, I didn't read it, but please send it to me again. I emailed it that night, and the next morning he calls me back and he says, Nick, would you consider coming as a keynote speaker? We'll cover it all. And I started laughing. Hey, I just said you could have the paper. I don't need to be there. And he goes, no, I want you to come and present this paper. And I go, what is the agenda? He goes, well, Robert Kennedy Jr. is going to be speaking. One of the commissioners from the European Commission is going to be speaking. People from UNESCO are coming. You know, the head of the Patriarchy in terms of this kind of stuff is going to be there. We got a lot going on. We really like you there. I said, okay, I'll go. I'll do it. You know, and so I get there, and I'm on the agenda with the first Catholic Bishop of Brazil, who turned out to be a really cool guy, and I mentioned him earlier. I met the executive director of the European Council of Churches, Rudiger, and he was really an interesting guy. And I met all these guys from different universities from around the world, and a bunch of smart people in business and politics. Again, it was the same mix: science, business, politics, religion. A weird mix all together in the same room, working through ideas. This was apparently the 5th and the final session to address this issue. They'd done 5 in a row. So when I arrived there, in those days my hair was a lot longer. I was doing a lot of indigenous work. My hair was down around my waist, and I used to always wear it back, and I didn't wear suits and ties. I really kind of loathed them back then. They figured if you're choking off that much oxygen for the brain, I could see what happened to so many people in government and so many people in business. I didn't want one of those choking me. So I'm there, and he says, look, I'd like you to be on the steering committee for this conference, and then I'd like you to consider being one of the chairmen of one of the 3 working groups that we're expecting to come out of that. And I went, oh, okay, I guess I'll do that. And then he goes, oh, and by the way, would you consider jointly handling the plenary session at the end with Rudiger here from the European Council of Churches? Now, what a plenary session is, for those that don't know, that's where you get business leaders and religious leaders and science leaders and political leaders all to agree on something that actually is meaningful, you know, and hasn't been watered down and dissected to the point of being neutered into nothingness. So that was the challenge for them, but I didn't know that was the challenge for me. But I knew all of a sudden I had a lot of work to do, and I thought I was coming there just to present something. And then what was going to happen with that paper that I did have on third world development is it was going to go to 1,000 parishes all over the world where it might get some use. And what it basically said, and it was funny because UNESCO presented almost the same idea, and they said, UNESCO said, we've screwed this up all over the world for hundreds of years. We've gone in with the philosophy of imposition. We'll come in and show you how to do it, rather than a philosophy that says what's here that we can support and not disturb. Wow. After hundreds of years, centuries of abuse from the very institutions, in fact, involved in this event, the final and foundational thing was discovered. Meet people where they are, even then, right? All this stuff we've been talking about, it still gets back to that. Meet them where they are, not where you are, not where you want to be, or not where you think they need. Forget all that judgment. Meet them where they are and find out who they are based on what they might tell you and how they might inform you. Then you might know something. My family goes to villages all over this state and is still respected because we did it that way. We went into communities and said, my dad, oh man, it was obvious the suffering. He wanted to know who was in charge. And every village ran a little bit differently. Sometimes it was an elderly man or woman. Lots of times it was elderly women, I can tell you, in a lot of these villages, because they were matriarchies traditionally. That's how they operated. You know, they were the ones who cared for people, and the men hunted and did the things that were needed to take care of things that were different. But the caring part of that village life and the natural structures of leadership, as my dad traveled around and tried to figure out what to do about it as a leader, what it came into was a different solution than reservations. Reservations had nothing but suffering too. He had seen that already. So this was a new model, a new attempt to transfer wealth in the hands of people. Now what I was doing in the villages was something different. Is I got asked by Chief Gary Harrison after he read that paper, he said, let's try that here. And it was basically a bottoms-up kind of thing. And part of that was applying Maslow's hierarchy of food, clothing, shelter, safety and security, belongingness, and self-actualization in that Maslow's hierarchy. And the thought was, and when I went to the council on that very first day, when we met, that here was the setting. That morning's newspaper had just come out in that area the size of West Virginia. And the political cartoon was a big one. It was a big chunk of the page. And it had an Indian laying on the ground. Written on across the Indian was the name Chickaloon. And on the neck of the Indian was the foot of our local senator, Scott Ogan, at the time. Now I got to know Scott quite a lot later. Not a bad guy, and really regretted not meeting with us, because it wasn't very many months when his effigy was being burned in the parking lot of a local elementary school with 1,200 people in attendance, which was way more than even lived in that part of our valley up there. It was like a lot of people. There hadn't been that many people screaming at government in the area since they formed the borough in the 60s. And they were really angry at him because he was listening to lobbyists and not talking to his constituents. He went through a lot of stress in his life at that time. He almost died of a heart attack, in fact. He was hospitalized, he got pretty ill. Eventually he was out of the legislature. I got to meet him in a different setting later, and his regret was not talking to us. And I think that's really was the problem, is people aren't, and that's the problem now. People aren't talking to each other. They're just making a lot of assumptions about what ought to happen or what not ought to happen, and no one's looking for the solutions. They're just looking at a way to blame everyone else and to be the latest group of victims who need the next thing to put salve on their wounds. We're all wounded. We've all been screwed over one way or another. Everyone's got a drama to tell if you want to listen long enough. But it's not the drama you lived, it's the life you live and the freedom that you live within it and how you build something out of a mess. And we're all in a mess. The tribal world is about that. I mean, what I did with Gary is I go out and I said, okay, what do we have to work with? And we looked at what was there, we looked at where the problems were. It's a long story of the rebuild. It's a separate story. We're going to tell that one day. In the next few days, Paul and I might even film it out there because there's a lot to see. And we're going to make that drive after we do this. Because what we did out there is show that you could create a government that functioned, that was a government. These are sovereign nations within the nation. A lot of people don't understand that about tribal governments. They actually have sovereignty. States don't. They lost it in the Civil War, actually. The way states are treated is very different because of the Civil War. The way tribes are treated as sovereigns is very different than states in a lot of ways. And yet subordinated in a lot of ways unfairly too. So tribal governments in Alaska are still lacking land settlements. I think there's room for a second land settlement in Alaska for the rightful governments. I mean, my dad did the best he could, but he did not settle with governments. He did not make a treaty. And there was not a vote or a consideration by everyone involved. There was the native federations, there was informal and formal groups, but you couldn't call them government. Those governments weren't recognized, most of them, until 1993, 22 years later under the Clinton administration, and Adair, who was Interior Secretary at the time. And what they did then is they recognized the tribal governments as valid domestic nations and gave them the recognition, but never settled anything with them. Those are the rightful governments, and they deserve a settlement too. And the federal government kept way too much land in Alaska, and 9% was not enough. Everyone listening to this feed should know this. The Native Americans of Alaska have not been settled with yet, and they deserve a settlement here. They deserve a fair one that gets them their government back. Because without land, how can you be a government in the right way? The corporations have their land. It was set up different. They're not like the Western, they're a weird hybrid. They're a social corporation almost. They're like an attempt to not have a reservation was made. And what Dad missed is what He would have fixed, had he lived, I guarantee it, he would have fixed it. Perhaps it can still be fixed by another generation of Begiches someday. But the fact is it needs to be fixed because it's not done yet. It's undone. The governments were always there. We didn't recognize them until way late in the game, but it's not too late. And they have a right to litigate. Every tribe here recognized in 1993, they got a statute of limitation under the UN Charter that goes 50 years. They have a right to raise this issue because now they're recognized and they have not been settled with. And anyone hearing this that has any influence over international bodies, they need to recognize this obligation as a global one that needs to be resolved. And the United States needs to meet its obligations. It failed me as a territorial citizen because I didn't have the right, my family didn't have the right to say maybe we didn't want to be a part of this. I know a lot of people might be offended by that. I don't want to offend anyone. I just want to ask the question. If in 1958 you were given the option of being the richest country in the world per capita, maybe you would have made a different decision. But we didn't get all the information to make that decision because I think Alaskans would have made a different one. And I think if military, the occupying force, hadn't been allowed to vote, it would have gone a different way. And no, we would have probably been allies, absolutely, to the United States because the value systems, at least then, were similar. But this needs to be revisited because it is this generation. It's not 500 years ago. It's not before the United States was formed. It was after, when all of us were responsible. Now what happened here when they came in here is, and they did this, the Treaty of Secession with Russia, what they said is Native Americans weren't citizens. If you were Russian and only spoke Russian, you had 3 years to return to Russia or poof, you were an American. But if you were a Native American who was born here, you didn't have citizenship rights unless you renounced your religion and could read and write English, which my grandfather couldn't do, and he became a citizen at the time. Listen, most of the white people here and most of the other people here, they couldn't do it. But that was the standard we put on the people that were here first. And in the South, they had, no dogs and no blacks, and in the North they had no natives and no dogs going into places. But our civil rights issues got addressed early here. Our state legislature did it in the 1940s, started fixing this mess, long before the civil rights movement in the States. When my dad hit here, there were things going on here, way before there were things going on in the States. But we had a long way to go, and we still do, and it's not resolved. What my paper did is give me an opportunity to do some things, and I got to do it in Chicxulub Village, as I mentioned. I got to do some things in Tyonek that I mentioned. And I've got to do some things with other tribal organizations in Alaska and Native corporations in Alaska, and I'm proud of what they've done in many ways, and not as proud in others. But it's going to be the next generation and succeeding generations, because think about the trauma of this whole group of people and what happened here. It takes now one more generation. The children that are coming up now have a fighting chance. Their grandparents have been hurt. Their parents have been hurt. They've been hurt by all of this. But there's a time now that we can heal a lot of this. The Native corporations are doing better. They're the biggest domestic corporations in Alaska now. When you look at the top 49, most of them are Native corporations. And they should be. They've done it. With 9% of the land, they've done it. They've made wealth happen here. What is wealth? We're going to get into it yet tonight. But they've done it because they've got land. They've got natural resources. They have labor. They have entrepreneurship. And now with the money, they have capital equipment, things that can make other things. These are the 4 factors of economic production. We're going to talk about them later. Money is the grease between. We're chasing the wrong thing. Real wealth are those things. We have our labor, but they're stealing it from us. We have entrepreneurship, but they're limiting that by making regulation impossible. Capital equipment is all about banking and equipment, things that make things. Capital is not money. It's shovels that make ditches and factories that make widgets. That's what they mean by capital in this instance. And then, of course, land and natural resources, the obvious. the real core of it. And that's the thing you got to remember is land and natural resources. When all of us were farmers in the 1800s, 84% I believe in 1830 were farmers. So that meant they owned land and natural resources. That means they owned tools and equipment that made things, capital equipment. That means they owned labor because they had to do this thing. And they were entrepreneurs because they had to make it all work and make money so they could survive. We had wealth. All of us had wealth. The vast majority of Americans have wealth. Now we have 401ks and little pieces of paper that represent someone else's wealth. Try and wipe your butt with a stock certificate. It won't do much for you. Ask them what happened in 1930 when that's all that they were worth or starting a fire. Now, why is the stock market so inflated? We'll talk about that later. But paper is not wealth. It's a placeholder for wealth. Something to remember. In Germany, before the war, they thought it was wealth until they were carrying wheelbarrows around to get a loaf of bread, of money. Wealth is the loaf of bread and what it took to make it, not the cash that took to buy it. And it's a key element when we talk about the tribal world because there it's about survival and subsistence. You have to get your food, you have to process your food, and you have to eat your food. You have to make a place to live that's going to survive. In this part of the world, ladies and gentlemen, anyone who did it and did it past the age of 40 was respected. And you know, I never understood fully why elders were expected until I heard it from an elder in a presentation in Chickaloon Village. And it wasn't because they're old, and there's a lot of people in the native world that think because they're old, and in a lot of other cultures, because they're old, somehow they automatically get this wisdom keeper title. That isn't how it works. An elder in a community, in a traditional community as I've experienced it, aren't just a bunch of old people at all. They are the ones who survived, who went through trauma, as I was describing earlier, and survived in a way that caused them to thrive, to make it, to lift others. They're the leaders in the world of survival, those that know how to live a long life. And those are the ones people would listen to because they wanted to live too. In small communities where the rubber meets the road, you know what it takes to live, and you cooperate as human beings to do it. The further you get away from this, the more detached from the earth, the things that are truly valuable in wealth, the more of the illusion you buy into and the more dependence on every other system. This is why my dad believed that getting the economic wealth and the mineral wealth and the real wealth in the hands of the people, they would decide what to do with that wealth, whether the land would be developed or not, what would be developed or what wouldn't. And they would make it work within the context of their culture, but they would decide. What wasn't put in place was a traditional governance system. By allowing corporate boards, it meant a totally different approach that was alien. What should have been happening there is perhaps that structure and parallel to it, a veto, the ability to preempt them based on traditional values on the traditional level. And that would have required recognition of tribes and settling with them, not corporations, and perhaps making a different structure. It's not too late. As I said, those weren't treaties. They're just laws, and they can be changed. Just like the Alaska Statehood Act. And what we need now is treaties with the tribes that are recognized, that deserve treaties, honor, and respect. And maybe a revisit of at least our Statehood Act that's been violated, because Americans should honor their word to the people that resided here, including me, before statehood. And we have a right to that. And it shouldn't be arbitrarily changed. And it has been for me as a white man, adopted twice in an Athabascan world. And you've screwed us all here. And you keep doing it by changing the rules. If you're going to change them back to the way they should be. You can't change it for the generations that are dead long ago, but this one is alive right now, and this isn't done yet. We're the last ones in. And it wasn't done right. You violated international treaties, and we have a right to be heard within our country, and if not there, in the international courts. But the tribes have to raise that issue, and it's their right to raise it, because you recognized them too late. But let's not do it with a fight. Let's not fight for our village on this one. Let's not fight. Let's find our path to the right solution that transfers from government back to people the wealth of the nation, because it belongs to us. When I think about Chickaloon Village and what happened here, and I miss so much of the Alaska story, we'll tell it again later, another day. But I want to talk about the kinds of things that can happen. With Chickaloon Village, they've made a lot of attempts to do a lot of different things with the land, and they've fought the corporation, they've been in litigation, they're fighting amongst themselves. It's inevitable that it happened that way. But a certain amount of land did get transferred into the tribal hands, and that got developed into assets that are producing revenue today. What we did there is we configured a team of people. We cross-trained everyone. We had to approach it totally different than Western management, had to reinvent the wheel a million different ways to find a way to tell people who had been told all their lives that they're losers that they weren't at all. In fact, they are the sterling example throughout this state of winners. Because what we talked about through the whole beginning of this is what we do there, what we did there. Help people see themselves again and their possibilities again within the context of culture, within the context of belonging, which the context of having food, clothing, and shelter addressed because you had a community that cared. I had one social service guy handle 1,100 cases in a year, and I never had one complaint. But I had a big percentage volunteer in our programs from time to time because we met people where they were. We went into the home when a disaster happened. We found out what was going on. We did the paperwork right there because it took a PhD to get it done otherwise. We didn't leave until the paperwork was done. Then somebody would get on the phone to me if it required an emergency decision because I had the authority to grant up to $500 for a fix. You know what that did a million different times? I mean, I'm exaggerating the times, but every time it did make a difference between someone losing or keeping a job, getting a car fixed so they can get to work. Simple things. Getting a safety pair of boots so they can show up on the job and have a job. Simple things to get someone to work instead of waiting for the state, which waits until you're thrown out of your house and it's a $50,000 fix instead of a $500 pair of boots, and someone with the authority to make the decision. What we had is systems that met people where they were, and when we ran into obstacles, we fixed them. If it was a regulatory obstacle, we addressed it on the regulatory level. If it was strictly a syntax thing, we could deal with it. But whatever the problem was, we went for the solution. Now, my federal auditor that would come in every year and watch me take those regulations and stretch them right to the point of popping, but they didn't pop. They were followed and they were met, but they served that village and the purpose of those grants. And we didn't get $1 from the state because the state wanted us to waive our sovereign immunity as a nation, and we wouldn't do it. We said, keep your money. We never took it. No way will we do it. Now, I helped them negotiate their first private lending. Now, banks don't like you not being able to sue you. You know, when you're a government, you can't sue a legitimate government. You can sue the state of Alaska, but you can't sue for tribal government without their permission. You know, within tribal jurisdiction, you can't do it. It doesn't happen. And that's kind of interesting. So what do you do if you're a bank and they don't pay their payments? Well, we did it creatively. We weren't going to waive our sovereign immunity because that means they could access any of our assets. What we did instead is we said, on this piece of property that you're financing, we will not exercise our sovereign immunity on it, which tells them, A, we have sovereign immunity, and we'll decide when we exercise it. Yes, we agree on that piece of land. They were taking the risk of the funding, and until their risk was gone, okay, we would do it, but only on that. And so that was a way for us to not to give up, not to have to say no, and for them to say yes, and no one lost anything in that. No one had to give up sovereignty to make it work. And the state is the same way. No one had to give up sovereignty to make it work. And they said it was fiscal responsibility. So what I said to them on one of those grants, I said, okay, we'll spend all the money the grant allows until we're done with it and we've performed every deliverable on this grant. And then you can come in and prove that we've met every requirement. We'll use our cash to do it. And at the end, you reimburse us. Or you tell us, sorry, you didn't make it. We'll take that risk. You have no risk at all. They wouldn't do it because they lied to us. And it was about waiving our sovereign immunity so they would get a pattern of us waiving it so they could say we don't have it someday. That's the government working with us. That was what was happening at the state. It's changed a lot. It's been a lot of years and a lot of, I won't say fights, I'll say a lot of learning that's had to take place, a lot of understanding that has to take place, to know what's happened here. When people see that 75% of the homeless in Anchorage are Native, they think, oh, they're just a bunch of drunks. No, they're not. They're a bunch of suffering people that we screwed over. They were all jerked out of their homes. Or their parents were. What would that do to you or me or any of us? It's the suffering we cause, and it's not from some past something, it's from what happened now. When I think about the third world and what's happening now we've got the new missionaries, we got the Chinese, we got the environmentalists, we got everybody telling them what to do. And you know what? I hope this time they don't listen to any of it. What we need is planning at the local level in a new way. I know some people working on that right now, preparing some initiatives to go statewide that are driven by Alaskan people. I think they're going to have a chance. I'm going to help them if I can. But that's the stuff I do as a volunteer. You know, I don't get paid for any of this, and I wouldn't want to. Even what's raised in this is to help Paula put a network together, a TV network, so others like me can be doing this all the time, that you can get good information.